Chapter 1, Part 2. David would always remember the day his mother died. He was in school, learning, or not learning, how to scan a poem, his mind filled with dactyls and pentameters, the names like those of strange dinosaurs inhabiting a lost prehistoric landscape. The headmaster opened the classroom door and approached the English teacher, Mr. Benjamin, or Big Ben, and he was known to his pupils, because of his size and his habit of withdrawing his old pocket watch from the folds of his waistcoat and announcing, in deep mournful tones, the slow passage of time to his unruly students. The headmaster whispered something to Mr. Benjamin, and Mr. Benjamin nodded solemnly. When he turned around to face the class, his eyes found David's, and his voice was softer than usual when he spoke. He called David's name and told him that he was excused, and that he should pack his bag and follow the headmaster. David knew then what had happened. He knew before the headmaster brought him to the school's nurse's office. He knew before the nurse appeared, a cup of tea in her hand for the boy to drink. He knew before the headmaster stood over him, still stern in aspect but clearly trying to be gentle with the bereaved boy. He knew before the cup touched his lips, and the words were spoken, and the tea burned in his mouth, reminding him that he was still alive while his mother was now lost to him. Even the routines, endlessly repeated, had not been enough to keep her alive. He wondered later if he had failed to do one of them properly, or if he had somehow miscounted that morning, or if there was an action he could have added to the many that might have changed things. It didn't matter now. She was gone. He should have stayed at home. He had always worried about her when he was in school, because if he was away from her, then he had no control over her existence. The routines didn't work in school. They were harder to perform, because the school had its own rules and its own routines. David had tried to use them as a substitute, but they weren't the same. Now his mother had paid the price. It was only then that David, ashamed at his failure, began to cry. The days following were a blur of neighbors and relatives, of tall, strange men who rubbed his hair and handed him a shilling, and big women in dark dresses who held David against their chests while they wept, flooding his senses with the smell of perfume and mothballs. He sat up late into the night, squashed into a corner of the living room while the grown-ups exchanged stories of a mother he had never known, a strange creature with a history entirely separate from his own. A child who would not cry when her older sister died because she refused to believe that someone so precious to her could disappear forever and never come back. A young girl who ran away from home for a day because her father, in a fit of impatience at some minor sin she had committed, told her he was going to hand her over to the gypsies. A beautiful woman in a bright red dress who was stolen from under the nose of another man by David's father. A vision in white on her wedding day, who pricked her thumb on the thorn of a rose and left a spot of blood on her gown for all to see. And when at last he fell asleep, David dreamed that he was part of these tales, a participant in every stage of his mother's life. He was no longer a child hearing stories of another time. Instead, he was a witness to them all. David saw his mother for the last time in the undertaker's room before the coffin was closed. She looked different, and yet the same. She was more like her old self, the mother who had existed before the illness came. She was wearing makeup, like she did on Sundays for church or when she and David's father were going out to dinner or the movies. She was laid out in her favorite blue dress, with her hands clasped across her stomach. A rosary was entwined in her fingers, but her rings had been removed. Her lips were very pale. David stood over her and touched his fingers to her hand. She felt cold and damp. His father appeared beside him. They were the only ones left in the room. Everyone else had gone outside. A car was waiting to take David and his father back to the church. It was big and black. The man who drove it wore a peaked cap and never smiled. "You can kiss her goodbye, son," his father said. David looked up at him. His father's eyes were moist, rimmed with red. His father had cried that first day, when David returned home from school, and he held him in his arms and promised him that everything would be all right. But he had not cried again until now. David watched as a big tear welled up and slid slowly, almost embarrassedly, down his cheek. He turned back to his mother. He leaned into the casket and kissed her face. She smelled of chemicals and something else, something David didn't want to think about. He could taste it on his lips. "Goodbye, Mom," he whispered. His eyes stung. He wanted to do something, but he didn't know what. His father placed a hand on David's shoulder, then lowered himself down and kissed David's mother softly on the mouth. He pressed the side of his face to hers and whispered something that David could not hear. Then they left her, and when the coffin appeared again, carried by the undertaker and his assistants, It was closed. And the only sign that it held David's mother was the little metal plate on the lid bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death.